are live.
Welcome to another episode of Acts of the Blood God, an independent RPG podcast. I'm your host, Kat Bailey. Joining me is Eric Van Allen,
Hello, hello, hello.
and Nadia Oxford is out this week, so we are joined by special guests from Kotaku. It's Ethan Gach.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
And this week we are going to be doing our maybe first annual 2024 RPG Studio Power Ranking. We asked the community and we put together our own list of all of the best RPG studios from Nihon Falcom to Larian Studios to Monolith Soft to P Studio and beyond, and made a comprehensive top 5 that you should remember. We'll be discussing that in just a moment. We'll also be doing a little preview of awesome games done quick, talking about what we've been playing, and of course doing our regular random encounters. Before we get to that, though, first of all, if you want to support the podcast, we're on Patreon at patreon.com/bloodgodpod, where we have tons of bonus content for both the show and for Charlie and Dropouts. Specifically, Pantheon of the Blood God. Right now, we are in the midst of a run through Final Fantasy IX. That's the next one that we're going to be playing. That was selected by all of you. Very excited to be playing that one. Ethan, what's your take on Final Fantasy IX?
I adore it and think it's slightly overrated.
Ooh, I like the cut of your jib, Ethan. Very cool. You can also find us on Twitter I'm on Twitter at @the_Catbot. Eric is at Cmusi, and Ethan, you're at American Truck Song 9. Is that right?
Yes, although it's that's the title. It's actually at Ethan Gach. So
At
it's
Ethan
just
Gach.
my name spelled, yes.
I was just guessing. How did you come upon American Truck Song as a name?
I forget what sent me down the rabbit hole, but there was I was just Googling a bunch of I got on a weird vaporwave trip on Bandcamp and then somehow got into a bunch of other stuff, and there were people like resurfacing like old trucker vinyls from the 50s and 60s, I guess. And I don't know if American Truck Songs volume, I think it was actually, there wasn't a volume 7 or 8 or 9, but volume 2 or 3. I forget if it was actually real or just someone being ironic, but I overtaken with fascination and intrigue. So I went with that one.
Well, if you haven't noticed, we are now on Twitch at twitch.tv/bloodgodpod doing our weekly live recordings there. We also have a pre-show and a post-show for our Stars of Destiny. The episodes are going up on YouTube. We're like a proper media company here with Acts of the Blood God. You can download old Pantheon apps over on the Patreon, and you should be able to download them in the app relatively soon if Patreon is correct. And of course, we're on the Acts of the Blood God merch shop, shop.bloodgodpod.com. Okay, it's time now for the first annual Acts of the Blood God RPG Studio Power Rankings. Why are we doing this? Well, first of all, it's because it's fun to rank things. I enjoy doing that. Kotaku is a master of just randomly ranking things. And
Got to sometimes.
You got to. Sometimes you just gotta. And I think this is a great opportunity to also sort of peer into the state of the industry at the moment. I don't think it's maybe a spoiler to say that some major hard hitters are missing from this top 5. For example, Bethesda is not on this list. BioWare is not on this list. So I think it's a useful snapshot, as it were.
It's kind of like preseason ranking in college football, right? It's the idea that like we're going into a new season, who's looking good, who's been on a hot streak, who's done some work and is looking like they're the top of the game right now. It's kind of a way to like check in, because I will also say that looking at the list that we put together, even the list that I made, and then looking at what's coming out this year, I feel like the list this time next year would be radically different too.
Yeah, I agree. So We'll be going through them in just a hot second. I suppose another thought that occurs to me when it comes to the power rankings of these RPG studios, um, pretty good mix between studios in Japan and Europe, but not necessarily American studios. But
I'm trying to think
all right.
what was the last great American RPG?
The last great American RPG. Well, BioWare doesn't count because they're based in Canada, right?
Oh,
Fallout New Vegas?
Uh,
no. It's not Fallout New. There's got to be something between then and now, right?
this is where we're like gonna like sit here and think about it, right?
I mean, it's like an indie studio. Chad,
An
help us
indie
out
It is.
here.
studio.
I think you're right though. It's like a glaring hole.
Well, let's go through the top 5 right now. Coming in at number 5 on our list of the top 5 RPG studios right now in the year 2024, we have CD Projekt Red, which I don't know that I would have put it on this list a year ago necessarily. Or they were trending back upward. They definitely had a huge dip for a moment, and then they kind of started trending back upward, and especially had a very good year with Phantom Liberty and Cyberpunk. And it feels like Cyberpunk is, after sort of 4 years in the wilderness or 3 years in the wilderness, is considered to be a big deal, as it were. So maybe better times are ahead for CD Projekt, especially with a lot of different projects in the works.
I think it's interesting because you hear CD Projekt Red right now. I'm sure people listening feel like one of two ways, right? Either Cyberpunk was great, it's like back, it's fully recovered. Phantom Liberty and 2.0 were great updates, or they're hearing CDPR and they're rolling their eyes and they're being like, "Oh, come on, they just fixed the old game. It's like that's not that." I think that's strange because pre Cyberpunk, if you said CDPR, I think a lot more people would be nodding in agreement because Witcher 3 was just knocking it out of the park like crazy. And so I guess the question ultimately comes down to, does CDPR writing the ship return them to a status that was equivalent to where they were at The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt? I'll tell you, like, spoilers from my own list. I didn't put them on my own top 5. So it depends on who you ask. But I do think it is, if nothing else, CDPR is definitely the studio that everyone is watching for their next move, right? They've got a lot of big games out. They righted the ship with Cyberpunk, for better or worse, and they're definitely a major player in the RPG space. Whatever they do next is going to be really big. So I don't think a power ranking is that strange at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think right now they're riding very high. So even there are like big questions about it. It's like right now the stock is trading at a premium in terms of, and you treat it, first of all, I think people, I don't know how much of it, it's always hard to separate the legacy of Cyberpunk's launch from people who played and didn't like it versus people who played and had issues because there were problems with the game on a technical level. Because you remember the initial wave of reviews of people playing just on PC for like 60 to 70 hours were pretty glowing across the board. And I don't know how many of those, it would be interesting to see maybe like a bunch of those people come back and re-review like the base build that you can install of the game and see if they still feel that way, or there was some, you never know how much of a review cycle like that is hyped up because people are coming off of The Witcher and the expansions and thinking like the studio is doing amazing things, and like it puts a glow on a game that might not be there a month or two after. But I think people forget how well received that game was at launch outside of the console version. And then if you look at it and just treat it like an early access period, like Baldur's Gate 3, it's like, yeah, 3 years later they released a Game of the Year contender, and I think it's hard. It definitely undoes, I think, a lot of the bad taste that the initial year left.
Coming in at number 4, maybe a little bit of a surprise. but maybe propelled a bit on the strength of the Persona series in particular is Atlas, which so one thing that we're gonna maybe clarify next time is are we talking about individual publishers or are we talking about individual development units? But Atlas is definitely carried by the relative strength of the SMT series and Persona. We just had Persona 5 Tactica back in November from P Studio. We have Persona 3 Reload coming out in February. And then I think there's a lot of anticipation for it's born partly by the anticipation around Unicorn Overlord and Metaphor Refantagio, which is just fun to say. It's so something that's rolled off our list. In our 2024 RPG preview, we were talking about how excited we are for Unicorn and Metaphor. And in putting together this list, we all put together our own list, but we also went to the community. And Atlas was pretty high up. Like a lot of people were picking Atlas, I think. So, Ethan, are you excited for Metaphor?
I've got to rack my brain. Which one is Metaphor?
Metaphor is the one by the Persona 5 developers, but it's sort of a fantasy. Yes. Yeah, fantasy Persona.
Right.
Yeah. No, I remember when the latest gameplay. I forget how much of it was actually new at the Game Awards reveal, but I remember like watching it and being like super psyched because I'm honestly I love Persona. I've always wanted to love SMT, but I'm excited to see them try and take a crack at a new lineage of something and not sort of be bound by the expectations of those other series. And I thought what they've shown visually looks great, and I always trust on them to deliver on sort of deep systems driven gameplay. So I'm hoping that they can do both of those things.
Yeah, like Metaphor seems like a thing I've really wanted personally for a long time, which is a game that uses a lot of Persona's ideas, the sort of management stuff and heavier focus on social links, but mixing it more with the just general look and feel of Shin Megami Tensei proper, of the almost imposing vistas. There's this great shot in the trailer where you see them running up a staircase and they're on this like giant castle and you can see this like big land stretching out behind them. And in Persona, I feel like you only really got that in the palaces and these kind of like make-believe places, but I wanted a big fantasy world that felt unreal and strange and distant, the way that a lot of SMT worlds feel. So I'm really excited for that, and also just we're in the year of high fantasy, baby. High fantasy is back. Like we are feasting good on fantasy RPGs in the next few years. So seeing that studio take a crack at it is certainly exciting. But Atlas, like you said, Kat, the publishing has been there. The studios they got under their wing are doing interesting, cool things. It's a pretty varied house over at Atlas, and I like everything they're putting out so far.
Coming in at number 3, it's another one. It's another big publisher. Maybe a little bit of a surprise to me because they've been so variable in the quality of their output, and we've made jokes about blunderbusses in the past. It's Square Enix. That's number 3, and it has to be on the strength of Eric just being absolutely in love of Octopath Traveler. He put it at number 2 in his list, and our listeners put it at number 1 on their list. And Ethan has a Creative Business Unit 1 at number 4. Which one is Creative Business Unit number 1, Ethan?
That's the Rebirth and Kingdom Hearts teams.
Yeah, I mean, Rebirth coming out is a big one, I think. And then we're coming off Octopath, and of course Final Fantasy 14 has been pretty huge. Eric, why did you put Square Enix up so high?
I mean, look, Octopath Traveler, come on now. But also, I was thinking about this the other day and talking with some friends about it, and Square Enix is kind of the company that makes RPGs right now in the broadest sense. They aren't just putting out really big prestige titles. And I think if you just look at their big prestige titles, you would be like, Square Enix, I don't know, FF16 was a really big hit, especially for people who don't normally play Final Fantasies. Forspoken, less so. Final Fantasy 14 obviously like riding high, doing great, still, on top of the world after Endwalker, even if the post patches have been kind of mixed in reception. But they do so many, like the blunderbuss does work in some ways because it means that Square Enix constantly has RPGs for you to play wherever and whenever you want to play them. So you want a farming sim RPG, they got that. You want kind of a real-time strategy RPG, they got that. You want a card-based RPG with Yoko Taro ostensibly working on it in some way, we got that. I really do think that Square Enix does a good job of just putting out a lot of RPGs, and they're all of at least some quality. Even, like the Dio Fields, which are not going to blow the barn doors off, they're not going to revolutionize the world. I still enjoyed my time with Dio Field and think about it more than any rational person or probably anyone else in the world thinks about Dio Field. So
I still have it installed because I'm like probably 3 hours away from the end. I'm like, I just need to finish this game.
The end is like the best part because it's the part that I keep thinking about over and over again. I can't believe they ended a game that way, and it makes me mad. And now they have to make a Dio Field too. If you're gonna end a game that way, you can't just not make another one. So, yeah, it's Square Enix just makes RPGs. They are the RPG factory, and I do think that most of their RPGs are of a pretty high quality, and then you do have some great standout hits. Like they're the ones making Octopath Traveler and things like that. So, yeah, they're the house you go to, they're the shop you go to get your RPGs.
Enix is interesting because lately we used to lament, whatever happened to weird Square Enix, the weird Square Enix of the late '90s, and it does feel like we kind of have gotten back to weird Square Enix in a lot of respects. Not always successfully. It doesn't always feel like Square Enix knows exactly what to do with these sort of strange creative riches that they're putting out. But it does feel like they're willing to take more creative risks, which is a lot of fun, honestly.
Dungeon encounters. They put out dungeon encounters. I give them points just for that.
Yeah, I feel like Dio Field is a perfect example of when that sort of works. Like, okay, I feel like you're trying something new here. The budget and resources are probably in alignment with that. And then there's other things where it's like, why did you bother to make this or bring it back? Like you probably this wasn't really serving anyone other than to like, oh, this genre's popping right now, or I don't know, maybe someone wanted to do like, Valkyrie Elysium or whatever. But it feels like you could go someone could go through the list with like a red pen and be like, not this one, not this one, not this one, and you could really tighten up the portfolio.
I think Visions of Mana is a really good representation of that too. Like the Mana series is back. Like they are making a new entry after doing the Trials of Mana remake and all that, which even that was a pretty big surprise at the time. It's just a sign that they are, I think, trying to create just a large, broad portfolio of RPGs that aren't all Final Fantasy 16 tier. It feels like they are trying to just get a like breadth of, okay, here's kind of some what you would say are like big heavy hitter AAA RPGs, and then like some AA, some like smaller scale, some even smaller budget, and they get things like Paranormasight in there, which is just wildly out of left field. I like the breadth of their portfolio a lot.
Killer Coasters points out Harvestella, which has a following, including, I believe Nadia was a big Harvestella fan as well. So at least they're putting out a lot. And then just from the top end, I do actually have a lot of anticipation in my heart for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Okay, coming in at number 2, it's a studio that did not put out an RPG last year and is maybe a bit more... when they put out a game, they put one out every couple years, maybe still riding on the momentum of their release in 2022. One of the best games ever, Elden Ring. And number 2 is From Software, which is, it was ranked pretty high. I put it at number 1. And our audience put it at number 4. Eric had it at number 3, and Ethan had it at number 3. It's pretty much on all of the lists, but it's not number 1. So, From Software should it be this high? Ethan.
It's really hard. I get really hung up on like definitions and like what things mean or what like so when I
You've
think
come to
power
the right
rankings
podcast.
when when I think power rankings, I'm like, okay, so like there's obviously my personal subjective opinion on like the quality of a team's output. Then there's also like the anticipation and hype around stuff. Like when you hear something about X game or there's a new thing coming from X team, you get really excited because they have that reputation or they're riding high at the moment. And then there's the question of like, is this thing, how much of it is renowned because it's an RPG? Like when people come to From Software games, are they coming because of the RPG elements per se? Are they coming because of the action and, the combat and world building and things that are part of RPGs, but also maybe slightly different? And so I'm almost kind of tortured over like, I think when you look and you're like, okay, yes, if these are action RPGs and they are some of the best games around, ergo, From Software is some of the best, is one of the best RPG studios out there. But I'm also torn because I'm like, that's not necessarily what I think of compared to something like Larian Studios or CD Projekt Red, where there's more of the conventional character development and branching dialogue and choices and quest design that makes me think more of the experience of pretending to be a character in a world versus like sort of surviving the horrors cooked up by a wonderful studio.
I think a lot of the joy in RPGs is discovery, and From Software is one of the absolute best of hiding interesting secrets all throughout its world. The joy of exploration, of secrets, of discovery, of storytelling. There's a very rich storytelling to be found. They just don't necessarily bonk you over the head with it during cutscenes and whatnot. And it's interesting. I there was a thread a while ago. Final Fantasy VI is not an RPG. It was a little controversial, and it focused very heavily on choices and that kind of approach to RPGs in the sort of D&D tradition. But to me, D&D, like it has heavy roots in the wargaming genre, and that is reflected in the fact that when you were playing the original D&D, you spent a lot of time in dungeons, rolling dice, and you still do to that extent. I think dungeon crawling is an inextricable part of role playing, and frankly, nobody does it better than From Software. Elden Ring has some of the greatest dungeons I've ever played in a game, period. One of our newly elected mods, Robo Riley, has been playing Elden Ring. She was talking about it on the Discord. And we were just like, wow, like Raya Lucaria, amazing. The old capital, the ruined capital, just huge, delightful to explore. So many scary things to find, big enemies, that kind of thing. And all contained within this world that is amazing to explore. So from a world building and a dungeon crawling standpoint, From Software is second to none. IMO.
Yeah, like playing Elden Ring, I think anybody who got teleported by that chest and wound up in Caelid remembers the first time that happens, because I remember I was playing the game and only maybe a couple hours in, and it's very standard FromSoft up to that point. And then I open a chest and get gassed, and now I'm in the third impact. And it's wild. They do incredible world building, but I think something that FromSoft does that is an RPG thing that I think is underrated is, we talked about, okay, RPG, BioWare, or other studios doing things where you have dialogues and you're making choices and you're talking to companions. You don't really do a ton of that. There is some of that in some of FromSoft's games, but it's not nearly as front and center as others. But you are still kind of making choices about the things you do. There are so many branching paths in the way a FromSoft game's storyline can play out, depending on which NPCs you do quest lines for and when, how you do things. I think of the Ronnie plot line in Elden Ring as honestly one of the coolest plot lines I've seen in recent gaming. Just the way that you have to suss out what you have to do. You have to choose to follow that path and to keep following that path and live with the consequences of knowing that you're doing something. You're progressing a quest, but it's going to cost you along the way, and you're going to have to live with what that is costing you. And there's a lot of different plot lines like that in Elden Ring that I do think are part of that agency, part of that choice, because at the end of the day, what FromSoft does very well is making you play as a nasty little guy who's in a real bad world. And you gotta run around and do nasty little guy stuff to try and survive in this gnarly little world. And that is a different kind of role playing than I think a lot of other companies do. Other companies let you do, I'm going to play this dragonborn cleric, or I'm going to be a sneak archer or a mage. But I like that you start as a gnarly little guy. You start as just the weakest thing in the food pyramid, and you have to work your way up to becoming this thing that is able to fell gods. And I think FromSoft captures that really, really well. The god killing in FromSoft's games is fantastic. So that's an RPG to me, and they certainly do it the best, I would say.
RPG checklist: killing gods, check.
All right.
Are you a murderer hobo? Check. I feel like Ethan had something to say, but we're on a little bit of a delay.
No, I when you were describing, when you gave that summation of FromSoft games being like a grummy little guy in a terrible world or whatever, it just made me, I'm butchering your description, but it made me want that version of Cyberpunk. Like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's kind of what I felt like the story of Cyberpunk was supposed to be, but it didn't end up being that. It ended up being something else that I really liked. But when I think of like that version, that approach to storytelling, I think I'd love to almost see From Software take go deeper down that path into trying to like have take a less naturalistic environment where there's a certain sort of approach you always have to exploration, like that, goes back to Zelda of just wandering fields, and sort of have a much more socially based version of like what would that formula look like in a much more social world where you're not necessarily like about to fall off a cliff or like, find some random beast, but there's these other ways in which you can be punished that are equally harsh, but driven more by like just not knowing what is going on in the world around you and the people and who are the power players and what they want and what they'll do. So that's I actually because I do feel like Elden Ring definitely pushed them much more in the RPG direction than any of their previous games, at least recent previous games. And so I'd almost love to see what would happen if they push that further.
And finally, coming in at number 1, a studio that has been held in high esteem for quite a long time, but really went to the next level in 2023. It is Larian Studios, the studios behind Divinity Original Sin and Baldur's Gate. It was number 2 on my list, number 1 on Ethan's list, number 1 on Eric's list, and number 2 on the listener vote. Would Larian Studios have made the top 5 before Baldur's Gate 3? I think they would have at least been at number 5. I think that they had been trending up for quite a while, right?
Certainly.
I think... Sorry, I was going to say, I do think Divinity Original Sin 2 did not get... I think maybe now people will go back and revisit it and maybe like it. I think obviously the Dungeons and Dragons aspect of Baldur's Gate 3 gave it a much bigger range. But I almost feel like that was also equally as much of a game of the year contender, and so I almost feel like this is just them. It's almost like I don't think it's as big a leap up as maybe some people who hadn't been paying attention might feel like it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Like DOS 2 was really big. Not as big as Baldur's Gate, but that's because very few things are as big as Baldur's Gate. Like Elden Ring, maybe, but even arguably Tears of the Kingdom was competing for mindshare with Baldur's Gate 3 by the end of the year, and that's a Zelda game. So in that respect, like they did set this massive thing, and recency bias can absolutely be tossed in here. And I would say like that's kind of the point, is we're assessing a studio where they're at right now. If Larian announced tomorrow that they're making Baldur's Gate 4, that's going to be the biggest game that anybody talks about outside of GTA 6 for the next like 3 years.
You think
But
so?
oh yeah, a new like if Larian came out tomorrow and said we're making Baldur's Gate 4, that'd be huge. It'd be
It would
gigantic
be.
news. But the flip side of what I'll say there is that Larian was building up for a long time. DOS 2 was really big. DOS 1, honestly, the more I've talked to developers, DOS 1 and you know, Pillars of Eternity were the big players in getting CRPG back into just the general gaming mindshare of saying this type of game works, this type of game can still bring players in just like it did years ago. Larian's like largely responsible for the success that they've created. It's not like they showed up late to the party with Baldur's Gate 3 and were like, we're here. Like they've been doing the work. They've been putting the work in. And so me putting them at number one for my own list is me saying like this is recognition of that. This is a studio that is stuck to its guns, has built up, has only gotten better over time, and we see the fruition of that. We see the way in which this studio has created its own success and hopefully continues to create its own success. So I definitely think they're riding high and easily like the powerhouse of the RPG industry right now.
The thing that's interesting to me about Larian Studios is that they sort of broke from a lot of the prevailing trends. BioWare and Bethesda really put a lot of emphasis on open world design and an action adventure sort of standpoint. And that also helped to drive the success of games like Witcher and Cyberpunk 2077 and such. A really Elden Ring, a really strong action component. And Larian went back to the earliest days of the genre and put a huge emphasis on the most important aspects of it: choice driven gameplay, a reactive world, and a deep sense of strategy and customization in your character. And in so doing, they managed to make a game that broke into the mainstream and defied a lot of the conventional wisdom coming out of the games industry. And that to me is very, very powerful. I mean, that's an amazing accomplishment. And now we can hold up Baldur's Gate 3 and say, no, RPGs aren't too esoteric for mainstream audiences. You don't have to add a action component necessarily. People will enjoy RPGs for their own sake if they're really, really well done, because having a reactive holodeck-like world is really compelling. And as a result, and Larian Studios is just at the top of that at this moment in time.
I do think that it is, people maybe underrate how like it is like they didn't really do. I feel like in some studios or publishers, when approaching a game like this, might sand down a bunch of rough edges to try and be like, okay, this is Dungeons and Dragons, we need a huge audience for this. And I don't feel like they did that at all. Like, you play this game and it is like very nitty gritty, moment to moment. Like, this is not a game that you're gonna walk into like GameStop and just get off the wall and be like, oh, I heard it's popular. Like, I'll give it a shot. Whereas like you could totally do that with Mass Effect. And even Dragon Age 3 to a bigger degree. And I think it's an interesting contrast with Alan Wake 2, which is another game that people loved this year. Mostly, I think a lot of critics and people who are like really into games like really love. But like, I feel like you have there two examples of studios staying really close to a very specific vision that is not necessarily always player friendly in the way that we might think of certain big budget blockbusters to be very player friendly and to kind of like propel you through a game, and not have much friction in it. And it's interesting that Alan Wake 2, I don't think really sold very well. Neither of these games had boxed releases at stores, but with Baldur's Gate 3, like, it did break out, and to your point, Kat, like, I think proved that like, no, this is a formula that actually does have mass appeal in a way that maybe even something like Alan Wake doesn't. And so, yeah, I almost feel like people are looking at this, and someone, some other big publishers are going to be like, oh, we could totally do a version of this and make it financially make sense, possibly.
There are definitely going to be people that look at Baldur's Gate and say, "Oh, we should make Baldur's Gate." And I pray for every one of the developers working at those studios right now, because you don't just make Baldur's Gate. You don't simply walk to Baldur's Gate, but you have to play through Act 1 and 2 first. But in the same way, you have to make DOS 1 and DOS 2 first. You have to understand as a studio how to build that game, because I've even seen criticisms from a lot of people who love Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 being like, oh, they didn't really make Baldur's Gate 3. They made Divinity Original Sin 3 and then put D&D over the top of it. And like, they did.
Feels more like D&D. It feels more like D&D to me than
it
initially
does.
In the earliest part of early access. It felt very Divinity Original Sin, and over time, it became more and more D&D. To me personally.
Absolutely. And I mean, we are also like, you can't understate the general D&D renaissance that is happening right now. The D&D movie was voted like the top rated thing in Rotten Tomatoes rankings and all that stuff, which by itself
was really good.
It was a really good movie. I really like that movie, and that movie also understands, and same way that Baldur's Gate does, why D&D is fun. The speak with dead moment in the movie that happens, that is absolutely just the funniest scene ever, and still like makes me smile. But that happens in Baldur's Gate 3. That's a thing you can just do, and that was, I think, not just happy coincidence, but Larian deeply understanding like why tabletop gaming is interesting and fun, and how it can be recreated in a single player or co-op experience. And I know so many people who are also playing Baldur's Gate 3 in co-op. They're getting family members to play with them in co-op. I like my own family right now is playing Baldur's Gate 3 in co-op with like their partners and friends and things like that. And that is just incredible to me that it has reached that scale.
The thing that stands out to me about Baldur's Gate 3, the Baldur's Gate 3 phenomenon. So I have a theory that gaming has started to reach critical mass with folks. Like, so many people play games. It has become very common for people 40 and under, I would venture to say, to have been playing games for most of their lives. And with the mainstreaming of video games, I think that gaming literacy has become maybe more sophisticated for people, because you're not trying to explain away the very basic concepts of game design to folks. It's embedded into a big part of the consciousness among people who play games. So something like D&D and Baldur's Gate 3 is going to maybe have more of a mass appeal than it would have had 10 years ago, which is all of me saying people are smarter now, and now they can finally appreciate RPGs for what they are. We're ahead of the curves, everybody, and now everybody's just catching up, and Baldur's Gate 3 is emblematic of that. What I'm saying is, Axe of the Blood God is pretty cool.
But I mean, yeah, people are definitely more willing to meet an RPG where it is, but Baldur's Gate 3 is just so effusively like itself. It is. I keep thinking about the ways that like it has a Githyanki character that speaks in Gith and hates you, and just says like brutal things all the time. And then you also have characters like Karlach who are just incredibly endearing, but then you have Astarion who's gonna like suck your blood, and that is a trope like that was a demographic identified and attacked through that character. But all of it is like so just itself. It's not trying to sand off or shore off any of the edges, that I think that does then appeal to people, because it's not trying to make everybody happy. It's just trying to be itself. And when you see a game so confidently itself, how can you not be interested in what it's doing?
It's a real joyful authenticity to Larian Studios. when you talk to them, when you get together with them, you can tell that they just love RPGs. They love making RPGs. They're not talking to you about their 10-year plan and revenue projections and things like that. They really are just nerds who are out there making the best game that they can. And I don't want to simplify or get naive about it because there is a huge business component to it. But I think that joyful authenticity ends up seeping into the mainstream consciousness. And that's why a game like Baldur's Gate 3 is so heavily memed out there, because people connect with that. They connect with the characters, they connect with the excitement of the game. And more than ever, I think having that sort of authenticity can be the game that can what put your game over the top, so to speak. People crave honesty. They crave joy.
Are you listening, BioWare?
Poor BioWare. They really care. It's just that, they've had EA standing on their neck for 15 years now, and that's a tough one,
I was gonna say, I don't know if we want to get into that later with our own list, but obviously that I feel like that's the most glaring when you look at what's 2023. So if you were to go back in time 10 years ago, I mean, complaints about the ending of Mass Effect 3 aside, I feel like BioWare probably would have been number one for a lot of people, and for maybe even similar reasons to why Larian is number one right now. A studio of RPG fans who love RPGs and have been making various versions of them for, many years, including Baldur's Gate 2 and Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. And so to Eric's point about you don't just make Baldur's Gate 3, you make Divinity 1 and 2 first. I feel like you would look at BioWare and think, yes, you've made, we're on Dragon Age 4 now. You would hope that there would have been a trajectory where the games would be getting easier, or you'd be able to make them more ambitious because of all this learning and knowledge and built up capacity over the years. But then, you look at the shadow of EA and just wonder, if BioWare had stayed independent, Larian is, if there would have been a different trajectory there, and it wouldn't have been driving out certain veterans at the studio, or people having to now make Anthem a live service game, or just having to the new expectations of being part of EA and saying, okay, well, the next game has to be bigger and better, so how can we manufacture that, as opposed to what's the game you really want to make, and then make that, and then if it blows up, fantastic.
It is such an indictment of EA that they drove out people like Amy Hennig, and that they're gutting places like BioWare, and they're saying, but how can you put Ultimate Team in this? It's a cool game and all, but can you monetize it?
I do briefly want to shout out, because this just really took me back. I did say I was going to call y'all out on the podcast. Blood God listeners, we need to talk about how we spell things. Atlas has a U, not an A in it. Square Enix does not have that many different variations of how to say Square Enix, and it's Bandai Namco, not Band-Aid Namco. But my personal favorite was, as we tabulated this list of what eventually became the solid listener vote, there was one person, and I'm not going to name them, I'm not going to put them on the podcast, but I am going to say shout outs to whoever put EA Tiburon as their selection for one of the best RPG studios. What a pick. I looked
Great
at
pick.
that and
Great
just
pick.
stared at it, and I was like, okay, sure.
Fair play to you. I mean, Madden is an RPG, sure.
There's stats, numbers do go up, but
It has been established. Madden is an RPG. I'm role playing as a football player.
I think to your point about BioWare 10 years ago, even when they were making Dragon Age Inquisition, as someone who has spent too much of his life playing BioWare's video games on various podcasts and for various content, even within those games, Dragon Age specifically, there are such radical shifts between each one that you can see the gears of publisher hands reaching in and turning and changing things. That Dragon Age Origins was a very classical CRPG, the kind that you would expect from the studio that made KOTOR and stuff like that. But then Dragon Age 2 infamously way more action, different sort of dungeon setups that didn't really vibe super well. I love the characters. Not everybody does. I know we can argue about DA2 later, but Dragon Age Inquisition trying to strike a happy middle, and now Dreadwolf, it's been in development for ages and we still have yet to see gameplay of it or really anything of it besides pictures of Solus. And I I do think that is evident of EA getting involved, but it's also, like we were saying, it's evidence of why you pit Larian and BioWare next to each other, and we see that one studio left to its own devices, allowed to create what it wants and build that like thing that they are good at and continue building up through it, they rise to the top. They do incredible things, and it frustrates me when I see EA leave BioWare out to dry like this and just chase out talent. And through all the reports that we've had going back years, like Schreier was reporting on stuff at BioWare like 10 years ago, and it's just years upon years of issues, and now we're like seeing that come to fruition, which is really a bummer. I really hope for the devs at BioWare right now that they can put something out that they're at least really proud of and really happy with at the end of the day.
I pity the folks at BioWare more than anything, honestly, because they really do care and they really are doing their best. But they labor under really difficult circumstances, and based on everything that I've seen from reporting and everything, there's a real friction between what EA wants and what BioWare wants, and I don't know if that's going to be resolved anytime soon. What were we going to say, Ethan?
Oh, I mean, to that point, I couldn't remember Dragon Age 2. What engine was that on?
Oh, it was definitely not on Frostbite.
Question.
Right, but it also wasn't. I don't think what Origins was on. I was just because when we talked about the shifts there, obviously that's a big one. And that's a lot of Jason Schreier's reporting had been around them being forced to use these new tool sets and trying to recreate their old games in them, and rather than being like, okay, what games are you good at making? Okay, what tool set will make sense for that? I think the Mass Effect 2 and 3 were in Unreal, maybe. But that's, I think, also when you look at the trajectory of Dragon Age and how it has been all over the place, you kind of wonder what it might have been like if they had something more consistent.
So it was in the, I'm going to say this terribly, Lyceum engine, which was kind of in their lineage of engines. So Eclipse, I think, was powering Origins. And then before Eclipse were some of the things that were making like Neverwinter Nights and things like that. So it was in their trajectory of engines, but it was after that point that they just went to Unreal, and obviously Unreal was a big part of Mass Effect, especially Mass Effect 2.
So that is the top 5 RPG studios as 2024 gets underway. CD Projekt Red at number 5, Atlas at number 4, Square Enix at number 3, From Software at number 2, and Larian Studios at number 1. Before we move on, I just want to shout out a few different studios that did not make the final list, but did pop up in other lists. One that popped up in the listener vote, and Eric, I think this one is relevant to your interest. Monolith Soft, developers of Xenoblade Chronicles 3. We might have put them into the top 5 to start 2023, just on the strength of that. Any comments on Monolith Soft, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, Monolith is doing really, really well. I think, they obviously finally won me over with Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and Future Redeemed was on a lot of people's end-of-year lists as this really impressive standalone kind of... I have only played Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Please do not come for me in the comments, but as I understand it, Future Redeemed is sort of a cap-off to not just 3, but to the series at large, including a lot of characters from 1 and 2 and a lot of tie-ins that people had questions about and that sort of thing. So I definitely see them as they're doing really, really well, and going into a year where we are once again doing the whole "is Switch 2 coming out this year" song and dance. Yep. You would obviously wonder, like, what could Monolith do with a more powerful Switch, because they were already making the Nintendo Switch work, like really, really work. So
they really did. I put Intelligent Systems, another studio that works closely with Nintendo, at number 5. They've just been doing it for so long, and their bar is really quite high. I really can't think of many genuinely bad Intelligent Systems games. And we are about to get a remake of Paper Mario Thousand Year Door in 2024, which, if I recall correctly, is one of their finest works. Unless I'm wrong and they didn't work on that one, but I'm pretty sure that they did because they worked on the original Paper Mario. And yes, they did. Haha, I'm smart. This is great. I didn't embarrass myself.
I like this
But
game we're doing now that we're recording live and can't fix later, that we're just saying things and then finding out if they're right later.
so very quickly, I mean, this is how it's been. So the magic of editing, we're working without a net.
God,
But
there's
Fire
receipts
Emblem,
now.
Fire Emblem is doing very well for itself. Of course, Three Houses is one of the better games of the Switch generation, and hey, I really liked Engage. So I would love to see Intelligent Systems break out more from the Fire Emblem series and flex a little bit. But consistently, I think they're certainly one of the best strategy RPG developers around. And Eric, you shouted out Nihon Falcom in your list.
Yeah, which is weird because I'm not personally a huge I wouldn't say I'm not a fan. I just have not played a ton of their games. They've always been on my backlog. But the problem is they have a billion games on that they've made. But I did just really want to shout them out because they've, I think, really built up a following. I feel like the Trails hive gets larger every single year. More and more people are shouting out that, I mean, Lord knows our listeners keep yelling at us to play Trails games. And I really, the same way that Larian has built up its own catalog, I respect studios that really stick to their guns and keep building up over time. And who better than Nihon Falcom? And East 10 Nordics looks sick. I've seen trailers and stuff for that, and that looks like a Vinland Saga RPG that I would very much like to play. And the Yeast series is one that Nadia has constantly talked about on here, and really seems like one that's to look forward to in 2024 when it finally comes over. So yeah, I think they're pretty primed to be making the stuff that our listenership certainly would want to play and be attached to. So shout outs to them.
And Ethan, all the studios that you listed in your list pretty much ended up making the top 5, but I'm wondering if you wanted to highlight any specifically.
Yeah, I don't. I had P Studio, Creative Business Unit 1 at Square Enix, and then From Software and CD Projekt Red and Larian Studios. I think that Persona 5 is maybe one of the best RPGs ever. I mean, obviously it's one of the best RPGs, but top 10 at least. Maybe in terms of just, I think, marrying just great characters and relationships and wonderful presentation and storytelling, and then just really interesting systems and dungeon exploring that doesn't necessarily I mean, it's grindy by nature of just the genre in the game, but I think they just do a really good job of making turn-based combat really marry well to the rest of what you're doing in that game. And I just think it's really I'm really curious to see what they do with Persona 6, and I think that series has been much more on an consistent upward trajectory than a lot of other RPGs in the last decade, decade plus. And then Creative Business Unit 1. I think to me it's really fascinating inside Square Enix, the 4 divisions. I think that it feels like cheating to say the team that's working on Final Fantasy VII Remake is leading the power rankings, but it also, I feel like I haven't seen as wide a swath of people be as excited for a game like Rebirth. I don't know. It's hard for me to remember outside of the big GTAs and I don't know. I feel like I'd have to go back to Mass Effect 3 to see as many different people in my life, including people who are really into games and people who write about games and cover games, to people who buy 1 or 2 games a year maybe and don't even know what's coming out until it's out, being just so excited for that game. And the fact that it now is going in a more open world direction, it just, I don't know, it feels like it could be a really defining marquee moment for Square Enix's creative juices. So
creative juices. Yes, both the Raven says Persona 5, the game that defined the modern Japanese developed RPG. I can't disagree. Okay, well, that's our top 5. RPG Studios power ranking for 2024. What did you think? Are there any studios that we're missing? Do any that you want to shout out? Hit us up on Twitter at BloodGodPod, or send me a DM or drop a note in our mailbag over on the Discord. Okay, it's time now for a series of random encounters. There will be an Xbox Direct on January 18th to show off Hellblade and Indiana Jones, among other games. Starfield is getting an update with over 100 fixes and improvements, and Eric is still not going to pick it up again. Netflix is casting Lawrence Fishburne in The Witcher Season 4. Yoshida thinks Final Fantasy XVII should be directed by someone new. Yoshida has a lot of opinions on where Final Fantasy is going. He loves to say Final Fantasy kind of crap, honestly.
Yoshida has earned the ability to say whatever he wants about Final Fantasy because no one's going to tell him to stop.
One of my favorite recent Yoshida anecdotes was that I forget if this was the Game Informer cover series or maybe it was an IGN post or something else, but someone else within Square Enix was joking about him. I guess when he wanted, I can't even remember what thing. Oh, the Picto. No, yeah. So this was, I guess, from the panel on the recent Final Fantasy 14 new stuff revealed, and about how he had like put together this entire presentation about changing the naming conventions for the Pictomancer class, and how like I think it might have been Tassi or someone else was just like we like just laughing like why are we having this giant business meeting to like discuss this, like we can just have like a chat over at someone's desk or something, but it painted this really fascinating picture of this guy who has this sort of rock star mentality, but it's also like putting together these elaborate pitch decks for the most minute Final Fantasy things.
The most minute Final Fantasy things. A demo for Grand Blue Fantasy Relink is live on PlayStation. Diablo 4 Season 3 kicks off on January 23rd. There were unfortunately big Twitch layoffs, and the CEO says it isn't profitable, which makes me nervous because we just started streaming on Twitch. Oh no. And finally, Golden Sun 1 and 2 are on Nintendo Switch Online. Congratulations to Rebecca Valentine. And also, go check out our Pantheon of the Blood God episode about Golden Sun. All right. Folks, Awesome Games Done Quick happening starting this week. It's back starting on Sunday. It's going to be going all week. And I just wanted to very quickly go through the schedule, talk a little bit about games that we're excited to play, because there are some really interesting RPG picks in here, including Final Fantasy 15 Royal Edition, which is live streaming on Monday at 2:17 p.m. And The Rise of Noctis can continue. Ethan, you're a Final Fantasy fan. Are you going to be watching this one?
Of course. Absolutely. The most controversial Final Fantasy, in my opinion.
Really? More so than 16?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, controversial for me personally. But yeah, 16 maybe for the wider people. But I don't know. I think 16's legacy will be cemented over time, whereas I think 15 will be one. I don't know.
Another one. Some other highlights include Pokemon Diamond and Pearl at 5:55 p.m. Pacific on Monday. And we're also going to be seeing streams for Cassette Beasts, which is a game that we haven't really talked about, but it's sort of a nifty, shall we say, variation of Pokemon. We're going to get Starfield on Tuesday. And once again, I'm sure Eric is still not going to be paying attention to that one. Octopath Traveler 2, though, Eric, your time has come.
Let's go. It's the Galdera run. I'm excited for that one.
They're going to knock it out in an hour. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the category restrictions are for the Galdera run, if that's a very specific category of fight or anything, but I'm fascinated to see what they do with that game because I think those systems are very malleable in a way that could be really interesting to watch RPG speedrunners specifically pick apart.
And if you're able to stay up until midnight on Tuesday, even though it's a school night, Diablo's getting streamed at 11:59 p.m. Pacific. And then heading into Wednesday, around 12:46 a.m., Paper Mario Thousand Year Door, which we were just talking about. So if you don't want to wait until the release of Paper Mario Thousand Year Door remake, well, then you can go play it. There's also a couple of another Pokemon Crystal, and then Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, which makes for a really nice RPG block on Wednesday. And finally, lots of great options to be watching RPGs on Awesome Games Done Quick. I really enjoy them. Very cozy, lovely to me. There will be Undertale, there will be Dark Souls, and all of that. Are there any other highlights you want to shout out, Eric?
Yeah, I love watching games done quick every year, and I have a lot of favorite speedrunners, and probably near the top of that list is Carcinogen, who does a lot of Resident Evil speedruns, and I believe they're doing a Resident Evil 2 stream at some point, and I just cannot recommend that one enough. The Resident Evil 7 speedrun that Carsey did at a previous GDQ is like one of my favorite GDQ runs to just go back and watch sometimes because it's a fantastic run, start to finish. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And also like some great Celeste stuff in here. The Armor Core 6 any percent true ending looks really, really sick. Like there's a lot of cool stuff. They do a lot of new games usually because those are obviously eye-catching and fresh and different, but I think a lot of the cool stuff is seeing games return with new categories or new ways in which they have to navigate it, and it's really exciting to see how runners have kind of broken open games over the years too.
There's going to be a Baldur's Gate 3 speed run on Saturday at 4:50 p.m. It's going to be close to the finale, followed by Final Fantasy V Pixel Remaster. So, two games that I absolutely love. And I'm also really looking forward to this Elden Ring versus Sekiro speedrun, as well as Fire Emblem Awakening. Saturday is going to be a lot of fun. The whole week is going to be a lot of fun. Awesome games done quick. A lot of fun, for sure. Ethan, are you going to be watching this week?
I will. I'll have it all in the background while I'm currently on parental leave. So while I am keeping 3 children alive, I will be. Thank you. I will be. It'll be a perfect time to actually be able to sort of pay attention to it. One of the things I actually love about the series is just how much you can sort of ambiently absorb. And it just reminds me of like watching games when my brother would play them and I was too young to, and just sort of like, it's like the most, if like a quiet long play is like very relaxing, chill, like low effort thing. It's like great to have so much information about a game packed in there and like thrown at you in like 3 hours.
I'm definitely going to be checking out some of the VODs for these because a few of these will be when I'm going to Iceland this coming week. So I won't be able to catch all of them when they're actually airing, unfortunately. But okay, rolling into the tavern now to talk about what we've been playing, what we've been watching, what we've been doing in general. And Eric, it sounds like you've been playing the Grand Blue Fantasy Relink demo. What do you think?
I am kind of surprised by it, is what I'll say. I'm not going to sit here and tell you all that this is incredibly good, that you need to run out and secure your pre-order right now. I just think it is different than what I thought that game was going to be. And what it actually is a lot more interesting than I thought. Because I think going in, I was just, oh, it's another tie-in action RPG. They'll have some like Grand Blue characters in there. You'll run through stages and beat things up, and it'll be very by the numbers. What it actually is like a very approachable monster hunter with specifically like pre-designed RPG characters that you're playing rather than so instead of picking a weapon that you have like your sword and board or your insect glaive or whatever, you pick one of the Grand Blue characters. And so last night I hopped on with a friend of the show, John Carson, and this is like the other thing that really appealed to me about this was that the demo lets you do multiplayer right off the bat. So you have a party of four characters that you select out, and that can be any mix of human people controlling the characters and CPU control characters. And so we kind of just went through the 3 missions they had in the demo, and 2 of them were really cool boss fights that had almost Final Fantasy 14-esque raid mechanics, where there were attacks showing up on the floor, and there was this rock golem that would like, one of his attacks was he would like burst out this like ring of stones that would like fly outwards around him, and then they would kind of spin out like they were Beyblades, just like rippling out through the ground. And so you had to kind of like dodge the first hit and then watch how they were going to curve around and like anticipate that to like keep your combo going. And so it's kind of like, what if Monster Hunter also had FF14 style raid mechanics, and you were playing these characters that felt very MOBA-ish in their designs, because they have built-in mechanics that are really like narrow and about what they want to do. So I was playing this caster girl that could charge up her attacks, and when she charged up an attack, she would gain an orb, and you could then use those orbs to power up her big magic spell. And you would get into this kind of groove of, okay, I'm like hitting my attacks, I'm doing like 1, 2, 3 charge, launch, and then I'm dropping this thing that was kind of like a black mage ley line. So like when I'm standing on it, all my spells charge up faster, and then I got to throw out the healing because my guys are getting low, and then here's some frost to help build up the stun meter. And it sounds complicated, but it's actually really, really easy to get into and understand and just do cool stuff in all the time. I was constantly like, I'm doing really cool shit right now. And yeah, I don't think it's I think it's really approachable. I don't think it's super in depth. It's, you're not going to pick this up and be like rewarded the same way you would if you played Monster Hunter and really mastered one of those weapons. Like, you're not going to get that sense of gratitude out of it, or sense of accomplishment out of it. But man, it's really fun to just load up with a friend and fight some bosses and be like, oh, I'm gonna play as Charlotta, who has E Honda's 1,000 hand slap for some reason, and I'm just gonna do cool combos, and we're gonna like fight stuff. And they have all these cool things where you can do almost like a Marvel versus Capcom 2, like I used my super and then someone else linked in their super, and it does like the little cut in art and cool cutscenes and stuff when people attack. And it's just hitting a lot of good buttons for me to be like, this feels like a game that I would not play by myself, but if I could convince 3 of my friends to play through it with me, we would have a blast. So yeah, maybe it's the exoprimal of action.
You're not
RPGs.
selling on it, dude. Exoprimal.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, Exoprimal was fine. It was good even. I don't like playing that game by myself, but when I was playing Exoprimal with friends, it is like the perfect social, you just need to hit things and kind of keep moving. You don't got to think too hard, and you can kind of hang out and, you know, knock back a cold one with the pals while you're doing it. And that is a subgenre. That is a thing that exists, especially for us weary adults who at the end of the week just want to hop on Discord and play some games with pals. And I think this like really narrowly hits that genre very, very well. So yeah, that's Grand Blue Fantasy. I'm sure people who like Grand Blue Fantasy will probably like it more because there's a ton of characters. There were 10 characters in the demo, and I think there's going to be more in the final game. So there are a lot of characters to get to know and understand, and they all feel pretty different. They all handle pretty differently. So it's more interesting than I thought it was going to be, is my takeaway.
Ethan, what's on your radar right now?
I am slogging through the end game of Final Fantasy X.
Whoa.
So I've beaten Final Fantasy X a couple times, including when it first came out. But my brother got me the Vita HD version, like, I don't know, whenever, like 6 years ago, like whenever the Vita was dying. And like every December, I would get like a few more hours through. But now that I have some extra time, I'm actually like going through it. And I've never 100%ed a Final Fantasy game before. And somehow I've gotten really into trophy hunting recently, which is kind of terrible. And it's sort of like counter to everything I think and feel about like my time on this planet and how it should be used. But I was like, all right, I'm gonna get the platinum for Final Fantasy X on my Vita. And so I'm going through like the normal stuff. I don't know how. I had no idea about Dark Aeons in Final Fantasy X. The end game of Final Fantasy X is so busted and so weird. Like you literally are like, oh, I'm gonna go back to like one of the first, Mihan Road, like one of the first places you go through, and then you will get jacked by a shadow version of one of your Aeons that is doing, that will one shot kill any of your characters, and you're like, what? I can't even like that. You going through the GameFAQs guides for like how to collect the different things and trying to figure out what order actually makes sense to be able to do these things in. Like right now, I'm trying to get Auron's celestial mass immune weapon and get the Mars. I think I have the Mars mark and I need the Mars sigil, which requires you to collect 10, complete your beast collection from 10 of the areas for the Calmlands monster arena. And so I'm like going back through some places. I'm like, oh, I can't go to that one because the sisters, who are the magician sister, the
Magus sisters.
The Magus
Magus
sisters,
sisters, yeah, will pop up and just like completely dunk on me. Which honestly, it's also fascinating because looking back, it's like the one that always jumps out to my mind is in, I think it's Arkham Knight, maybe Batman Arkham Knight, when you're flying around and the game will randomly pair you with the Bat guy, Bat monster, whatever. I'm forgetting the names.
Man-Bat?
Like, yeah, Man-Bat, yeah. Or honestly, well, Final Fantasy VI should be the better comparison, I guess, with, was it Doomgaze, which will just randomly find you in when you're flying around. It's that similar sort of thing. Like, I'm sure playing this game for the first time, you just wander back and you're like, oh my gosh, like, what is this? It just killed me. This is terrifying. And it kind of has that weapon from Final Fantasy VII energy to it, but it makes actually tackling the end game just so obtuse because you're like, there's no clear set path of like, okay, I want to get Yojimbo to just who you can pay Gil, and there's like a secret relationship you can have with Yojimbo in order to get him to use the special attack that will one-shot kill enemies. I'm both intrigued by how arcane, compared to the rest of the game, which is very straightforward and pretty linear, how arcane the end game is, and how you would actually know half of these things without looking at a guide. But so that's the long and short of the world that I'm in right now, which is both fascinating, and there's been a couple times where I really should have went back and saved and didn't, and I'm like, I'm too old to be losing an hour of grinding boss battles.
I think part of the appeal, I think guides are part of the experience in its own way, because a lot of these games were designed with guides in mind, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because it can create sort of a word of mouth as people discover things. But on the flip side, it can be a lot of fun to be playing a game and then being like, but I want to go to the next level. Like, how much deeper can this go? And picking up a guide and seeing it all laid out before you can really give you an appreciation of the true depths of a game. And I think Final Fantasy X, those Dark Aeons are crazy, but they really do push the systems to the absolute limit. And I'm never happier than discovering that a game that I like goes so much further than I could have ever expected. We were talking about Elden Ring before. This is another great example of a guide-based game. But to me, the Final Fantasy X endgame really took that particular game to the next level.
Yeah, the 10 Platinum is the bravest thing to undertake in RPG gaming, so I wish you luck, but also
Godspeed.
Punch out whenever you feel like it's becoming too much, because 10's endgame, I think, is maybe one of Final Fantasy's like most extensive endgames ever, if you're just counting monster collecting and sphere grid, and oh my gosh, the optional bosses are such a step up, it's not even funny. And even just getting the Thunder Plains stuff and all that, the Blitzball stuff. I was at my parents over the holiday break and was watching my brother play 10 because he was trying to get some of the Blitzball stuff. And I was just like, I forgot that if you play through 10 normally, you probably play Blitzball once and then you're done with it. But if you play 10 for like completionist's sake, to get everything, you have to play so much Blitzball and engage with all of these systems that you really just don't touch otherwise. You go 0 or 100 on it, there's no difference. And Godspeed, Ethan. Godspeed.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm also getting the platinum in Final Fantasy 16, which is like a cakewalk in comparison. It's just not even. It's almost disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of Final Fantasy, I rolled credits on Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster this week, and this is a big deal for me because I have been trying to finish Final Fantasy V for about 20 years now, going back to when I was in college. And
Oh my gosh.
I've picked it up many times and kind of got to a certain point, then put it down, then felt kind of overwhelmed. But this time with Pixel Remaster, I pushed all the way through. And I have to say, Acts 2 and 3 are so good. I had such a great time with them. And as you get deeper and deeper and build onto the systems and just unlock all of the secrets of the different jobs and fight these ever more increasingly intense boss battles, oh, it's so good. And it really culminates in the final dungeon. People love to drag X-Death, but the existential horror of the void, I think, is a pretty powerful enemy and fits really well into the themes of Final Fantasy. Because if Final Fantasy is about optimism and being connected to the world and everything, and X-Death is all about nihilism and death and literally the cold, dark void of interstellar space. And a great final dungeon. I'm not going to spoil it, but you do have a lot of boss fights throughout. It's almost like a boss rush in some ways. And I discovered that there are multiple optional bosses in there as well, at least 2, including Omega Weapon, basically. And I didn't realize that Omega Weapon from Final Fantasy VIII was basically just pulled from Final Fantasy V. It's just a... and the descriptions of it as this murderous robot that came down from the heavens and is just chilling out and will murder your party. It was really cool that they came up with these really intense final bosses for Final Fantasy V. But in the end, I stepped away from Final Fantasy V going, wow, what a great experience. And by the way, I had on the way is I think it's my favorite Final Fantasy anthem at this point. Ethan, did you ever finish Final Fantasy V?
I did back when it came out via the Chronicle. No, was it Chronicle? What
Anthology?
compilation was it? Anthology on PS1, yeah.
Dude, congratulations, because that's a slog.
No, yeah, it was. And I remember the first time I was too young, and then I think years back, like a few years later, I went back through it. I mean, it always sticks in my head very early on the library that catches on fire, and you have to fight all these bombs. And I just remember being like, I hate this. No, thank you.
Act 1 is actually a big barrier to entry because I don't think Act 1 is that fun in Final Fantasy V. I think it gets really good once you get into Acts 2 and 3. But I also like that the main enemy of Final Fantasy V is just a giant murder tree that wants to kill everybody. That is one mean tree. But if you haven't played Final Fantasy V, Pixel Remastered is a great opportunity to pick it up. Somebody was asking me, I think it was Marvel from Experience Share, supporter of the show. Thank you very much, Marvel. Was asking me last night, should I play? I've never played Final Fantasy 5 or 6. Which one should I play first? And I said, if you play 1, play Final Fantasy 6. If you play 2, play Final Fantasy 5 as well. And he was like, okay, so yeah, Final Fantasy 6 is the way, but you could do worse than playing Final Fantasy 5. And also, I felt like I appreciated the series so much more because there's a ton of references in both Final Fantasy 8 and 9 to 5. 5 is a real touchstone, especially in Japan. So, yeah, I feel like I just have a much better appreciation for the series as a whole now that I've finished 5. I'm really grateful for that. And by the way, somebody was asking me recently, what do you want, Kat, in the next Final Fantasy, in Final Fantasy 17? And I say to you, bring back the damn job system, y'all. Come on. It's been too long. The job system is iconic. Every good Final Fantasy often has a good job system. And it's just, I sort of feel like a real omission that they don't have it.
But you know what had a good job system? Stranger
don't
of
say
Paradise.
It. Okay.
Stranger of Paradise. What?
Okay.
What did you think I was
I
going
thought
to
you were going to say
say?
Lightning.
Okay.
I thought you were going to say Lightning Returns.
I thought you were going to say Final Fantasy 14.
Oh, you know what has a great job system with so many options? And if you like Final Fantasy V references, let me tell you, Kat, Final Fantasy 14's got them in spades.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah. I don't know. I came away from 5 going, God, I really love Final Fantasy, and that almost makes me want to play 14 because 14 is the example of God, I love Final Fantasy. It's just Final Fantasy references all the way down. But,
I'm surprised they haven't found a way to release a I know there is a version of it you can basically play single player, but like I'm almost surprised they haven't tried to find a way to create a single player Final Fantasy 14 offline version that they could package and sell in like, X increments that I feel like a whole new swath of people would totally play through. And the content is there. I just don't know how feasible it would actually be to try and strip it into something like playing episodically just to experience the story and world in a very linear fashion.
I don't know. I feel like you're not getting the experience at the end of the day, Like part of 14 is not just the beautiful story, the incredible music, the sights and sounds. It's walking into the Limsa Aetheryte and seeing the weirdest thing you've ever seen in an online MMO. It's about seeing people advertise their nightclubs in Party Finder while you're trying to find a match for for like a Ruby Weapon EX run. Like that's part of the experience as people, it's social in that way. So that would cut its claws, I think.
that's it for the tavern. We don't have Nadia here, so we don't have a pit, but it is now time for industry story time with Kat Bailey. I've been in the games industry for way too long. I said recently to Nadia, who's been in the games media for even longer than I have, that she should get a lifetime achievement award for just managing to stick around this crazy business for 20 years or whatever. But I asked you, Ethan and Eric, do y'all remember debug units in the games
Hmm.
industry? Did you ever have one? Is what I'm asking.
No, by the time I was like really into reviewing games, everything was basically digital. Like even physical copies of games weren't really being sent out unless it was like Nintendo.
Yeah, I never had a debug unit. I've played on debug units before, but I've never had one. I never got to see the magical like locked down unit that places like larger outlets had. I did get sent for a preview one time for some game I can't even remember the name of, but I still have it on my shelf back there. A like cart that was just they sent it in a Vita case that was just obviously a blank like no fancy cover art. This is not like a box copy thing. And it was just a Vita cart inside that just had like serial numbers on it, and that was what I put in to play the preview of whatever game it was. And I remember that being such a novel thing. Was it's like someone had sent me a burned disc that had the preview build on it or something like that, and they were just like, "Here, play this. This is what the preview's on. We're not going to deliver it digitally. It's a physical chip like this that you have to put into your Vita." And that was the most bizarre situation I've ever been in, and so I've held on to it for that reason alone. But no, like Ethan, by the time I was really getting involved and working with pre-release code, pre-release games and stuff like that, I feel like the debug has largely been phased out for digital code at this point.
In the long ago, if you were freelancing in the games media, having a debug unit was a huge deal because typically games would come out on these burned discs that would not run on retail units of consoles. So if you wanted to review games, you had to have a debug unit. And they really did look like they were just a burned pirate disc. Sometimes somebody just wrote in Sharpie the name of the game on the disc. And I had a debug Wii, and I was using it to play Sakura Tyson, one of the very few Sakura Tyson games to come out in the US. And I discovered that actually debug units could also play Japanese games region free. When I stuck SD Gundam G Generation for the Wii into the thing, and it worked. And I was like, oh my God, I have found a life hack. I can play Japanese Wii games on this thing. Huge deal for me because at the time I was still playing a lot of regional games, and region free wasn't as much of a thing. Also, speaking of Wii's, if you reviewed Nintendo games in those times, they literally bolted the Wii and the Nintendo DS to a desk. I reviewed a Yoshi's Island release on Nintendo. I think it must have been 3DS, while it was chained to a desk. And I literally had to just come into the office and sit there and play it the entire time, hunched over this device that could not be moved. So it was a time. And 3DS and DS cartridges came in these huge, crazy blocks. They weren't the little carts. They were like big, chunky blocks that made your DS kind of heavy and kind of awkward. So I don't miss that era. Actually, I like just being able to download a game, even though you have to jump through a lot of hoops at times, especially on the Nintendo Switch. But that was a time to be alive, and there was the way that you could separate out freelancers were the ones who had the all-powerful mythical debug units. But the last time I had one was, I think, a PS4 debug, which I said goodbye to some years ago, and since then has not really been a thing. But that's been it. Go ahead.
It was gonna say, it's like it was a tribute. I feel like the biggest change was like it was a tribute to a time where games, you had access to games earlier, like as a reviewer. In a lot of cases, like the very idea of having a debug unit, because they're sending you a version of the game that is not like the final release, and like here's the list of things that like your issues you might run into, etc. And now you get those as a reviewer, but it's like the and we're gonna fix that in the day one patch, but like this is the game that we're selling people. It's just amazing to think that, because I you know, especially when magazines were much bigger and there's a lot longer lead time on companies sending games in order to get the review out in a timely fashion. Like I just, as a newer person, think like, oh my gosh, what a time to be alive, where like there was that sort of lead time that you could like sit on, you know, play through the thing for like however many hours and sit on it and think about it, and maybe even like start a new run through, and like just, as opposed to like, all right, the game's out in a week, the embargo's on you know, Monday after a weekend, and you know, good luck.
It was still pretty intense. I mean, magazines got games earlier, but websites frequently had the same sort of ridiculous embargo lead times. But then you had to like literally get the games in the mail, right? You would be checking your mail every day going, is it here? Is it here? Oh my God, thank God, it's finally arrived. And you were also often praying for a retail release rather than a debug release, because swapping over to the other cartridge was a giant pain sometimes. But for a long time, I had a lot of just random review discs floating around. I had a Dragon Age Origins beta floating in my house for quite a long time from PC, because I did the guides for that one, for example. So, and if you think Rockstar is secretive now, I had to plug a USB into the memory stick drive of a PS3 in order to make the debug version of LA Noire work. And that's how I played through it the entire time, because you had to install this like special SDK thing in order to even unlock LA Noire, because that's how secretive they were about it.
I mean, even nowadays, those levels of secrecy still exist. They're just way more like you have to log on to our service and access our specific thing and all that kind of stuff. Like it's much more. I think the funny part nowadays is they're just worried about people being seen online as playing the video game that is coming out in 3 weeks. Like I always thought it was weird that companies are very secretive about like you can't even appear online playing this game, as if the knowledge that a game reviewer is playing a game that's going to come out in a week and a half is like some earth-shattering piece of information. That's like, yeah, there will be some rags that write that up or whatever, but like, who cares? It's the game's coming out, it's gone gold, you've tweeted about it and stuff like that, it's whatever. But I do think it's interesting that we have largely shifted over to a digital space, because it does like take down on the waste a lot on our ends. Like getting physical copy was always a pain in the butt, like you said, and it's just reflective of the times. I have a feeling that we were talking about Baldur's Gate 3 earlier, even things like Lethal Company, like the largest games in the world are digital only at this point, or at least digital first. And it does mean we miss out on some of those strange oddities that we would pick up over the course of the years from covering games.
We also don't have review events anymore, and frankly, I'm kind of okay with that
Thank
at
God.
this point.
Yeah.
Like getting locked into a hotel conference room for 3 or 4 days, playing a game until your eyeballs fall out, surrounded by, well, a lot of dudes, usually wearing gaming t-shirts. But
Yeah, former Kotaku editor Alexandra Hall was telling me about. She had been reviewing, I think it might have been for GameSpy at the time, Metal Gear 3, Metal Gear Solid 3, and at Konami, whatever Konami offsite office, like, you know, everyone's there, they're ordering you pizza. And I'm like, that sounds absolutely miserable.
yeah.
Like to be with a bunch of people I don't know in a weird place, eating not great food for days on end to just mainline this game. Like that sounds, I can't, it's amazing that like those reviews got written.
And that's it for this week's episode of Acts of the Blood God. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, if you want to support the show, patreon.com/bloodgodpod, where for just $1 a month, you can get the show ad-free and join our Discord, hang out with our amazing community while we're talking about games done quick and all that jazz. Get access to the Pantheon episodes. We were talking about our Final Fantasy X runs. Well, hey, the Final Fantasy X Pantheon is available right now on Patreon. If you want to just go and get the episode a la carte, it's right there. You can go check it out. Follow me on Twitter at @the_catbot. Nadia is at Nadia Oxford. Eric is at CMusi. And Ethan, you're at Ethan Gach. Is that correct?
Correct.
Excellent. And special thanks to Victor Hunter for producing this episode. We'll be back next week, as always, to talk more about the genre we love. We're heading into the post-show now to hang out with our Stars of Destiny. So go and hang out with us there if you want over on the Discord. But in the meantime, for Eric, Ethan, myself, thanks for listening and happy adventuring.